I'm Courtney Smith.
And I'm Elise Sharp.
And we are two Shakespeare nerds who decided to make a podcast about our love for Shakespeare.
In this podcast, we will tackle as many dimensions to Shakespeare's plays as we can by looking at the text, examining the historical context in which it was written, and how the text is viewed through modern lenses of feminism, racism, classism, colonialism, nationalism, ableism, all of the isms.
We will discuss how his plays shaped both the past and present, and, as actors, how his plays can be responsibly performed today.
All while trying our best to approach his works without giving in to bardolatry. So, Shakespeare, anyone? Hi, listeners. Elise here to remind you of all the ways you can support the podcast and the work that Courtney and I do. First up, we have a Patreon. Our Patreon patrons receive exclusive bonus content. Every month, we do a roundup of Shakespeare-related content we have found online. We also share Patreon-exclusive bonus episodes of the podcast. These look like extended versions of episodes you've heard here, collaborations with other Shakespeare podcasters, and Courtney and I doing reviews of Shakespeare-adjacent media, like TV shows, movies, and books that are inspired by or loosely based on Shakespeare and Shakespeare plays. Patreon patrons also receive snail mail from the podcast, and some levels even vote on future episodes of our podcast. If you are interested in checking out our Patreon, or just the Shakespeare-related names we've given the tiers of support, head to patreon.com/ShakespeareAnyone. The link is also in our episode description. After you've done that, please rate, review, and follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Your review might even make it on an episode. You can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and tell a friend. Word of mouth is our best form of advertising. Thank you so much for all of the support you give the podcast. Now, on to the episode.
Hi, Elise.
Hi, Courtney.
How's it going?
It's going pretty well. How are you?
I'm also doing well. We were just complaining is not the right word because that's so negative, but we were commiserating with each other because of the warm weather.
Yes, we are both in a heat wave. So we were just like, oh, it's starting to get warm in here. In these rooms where we've turned off fans for better sound quality.
Yes, but we persist.
You got to suffer for your art sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
I am really excited today because we have a friend of the podcast, I think we can call her that, Dr. Danielle Rosvally, back to talk about her new book, Theaters of Value, which is out this month from SUNY Press. Theaters of Value explores the idea that buying and selling are performative acts and offers a paradigm for deeper study of these acts. Quote, the dramaturgy of value, unquote. Modeling this multifaceted approach, the book explores 6 case studies to show how and why Shakespeare had value for 19th-century New Yorkers. In considering William Brown's African Theater, P.T. Barnum's American Museum and Lecture Hall, Fanny Kemble's American reading career, the Booth family brand, the memorial statue of Shakespeare in Central Park, and an 1888 benefit performance of Hamlet to theatrical impresario Lester Wallack, Theaters of Value traces a history of audience engagement with Shakespearean cultural capital and the myriad ways this engagement was leveraged by theatrical business people.
That book sounds like it's right up our alley.
It does. And listeners to the podcast will know we've engaged in sort of this time period and how there was this cultural trend of reinvesting in Shakespeare's cultural capital. For example, during our King Lear series, we talked about how the early field of psychiatry used Shakespeare. In our episode on Anne Hathaway, we also traced how depictions of Anne Hathaway parallel and intersect certain levels of interest in Shakespeare the man versus Shakespeare the genius. And we've talked about, how Shakespeare was sort of put up on his pedestal during this century. It's right up our alley. And I'm just so excited to have Danielle back and talk to her. Mm-hmm. Danielle Rosvally is an assistant professor of theater at the University of Buffalo. Her work examines Shakespeare as cultural capital, particularly iterations that intersect with performance and theatrical labor. Her book, Theaters of Value, Buying and Selling Shakespeare in 19th-Century New York City, explores how 19th-century New York theater makers bought and sold the commodity of Shakespeare, and how these performances of value intersect with American nation-building and national identity. Her next project, Yossified Shakespeare, is a multimedia exploration of how iterations of Shakespearean performance and Shakespeare's cultural capital critically intersect with drag and drag aesthetics. Danielle is a fight director, actor, and dramaturg. Her work has been published in Theater Topics, Studies in Musical Theater, Borrowers and Lenders, Early Modern Studies Journal, several edited collections, and Shakespeare Bulletin, as well as on TikTok at Yossified Shakespeare. And now, on to the episode. Hi, Danielle. Welcome back.
Hi. Thank you. It's so good to be here. It's starting to feel like coming home.
Oh, thank you. We're so excited to talk to you today about your forthcoming book. This is huge. Congratulations, first of all.
Thank you. I know I keep saying it, but I've been writing this book for over a decade, so it's crazy that I can hold it in my hands. It's an object that I can touch, and it's got my name on it and a really pretty cover, if I might add.
I was just about to compliment the cover. That's a banger of a cover.
Yeah, they ripped out all the stops. If you're listening, Google the cover of my book and you will understand what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So to start off with, what is your book titled?
My book is called Theaters of Value, Buying and Selling Shakespeare in 19th-Century New York City. And that is a title that happened after I got on board with a press. So it had a different title for the duration of its working life. I have been calling the book Value and Worth. So I think I've just recently started calling it by its proper title, but if I slip up, that's why.
Oh, we understand. We overstand on that. We call our episodes things internally for a long time before we figure out what they're actually going to be called. So in this book, you explore this concept of the dramaturgy of value. Can you tell a little bit more about what led you to explore or perhaps create this dramaturgy of value?
Yeah, so I've been doing a lot of thinking about the things that happen in this book for a very long time. And a thing that happens kind of naturally when you get interested in history is you start to find things that seem to connect, like interesting events in history that seem related for some reason. And at some point you collect enough of them that you're like, well, this is a project. But like just a collection of interesting events in history does not an academic book make. So I had to start asking questions about what was interesting about them and like, why did I find them so fascinating? And would other people find them interesting? And how could I get other people to be interested in it? And I started to realize that what was really interesting to me is the idea that value is a performance. So the idea that when we as consumers or we as people selling something invest something with value or spend money on something or spend time with something or whatever, this is a performance. And once I started to accept that concept, I realized, oh, so what I'm actually doing when I analyze these things is dramaturgy. And if I say it that way, then theater scholars will understand what I'm asking them to do, right? So sometimes getting scholars to cross-apply their skills is really just like, frame it in a way that means something to them. And theater scholars know what dramaturgy is, although a lot of the world doesn't. And they know how to do dramaturgy. So if you tell them this is a dramaturgical exercise, they'll be like, oh, okay, like I can get on board with that. So that's sort of what led to my thinking in making the dramaturgy of value and why I think it's really important for us to consider.
How do you, Danielle, define value in this work?
Yeah, this was fun because go ahead and try researching economics with no background in economics, which is what I had to do. So sort of a classical economic definition of value by a major economist, L.M. Fraser, he says there are four sort of nuances of value, right? He says cost value, which is the cost to make something, exchange value, which is what someone can acquire by selling an item, or alternately what someone would give to have the item. And then use value, which is measured by how useful something is. And then esteem value, which is measured by usefulness in combination with the ease that one acquires something, with easier things having less esteem value, right? If you can get it easier, then it's invested with less value. So those are sort of the four things that I think about when I start to think about the term value. And also, writing a book about economics when you're not an economist will start to make you realize how often you use the term value and start to make you question what you actually mean by it. And it's one of those things that if you say a word too many times, it will lose meaning. Mm-hmm. So over the last decade, I've said the word value so many times that I'm like, what is this combination of consonants and syllables? And that's the best way that I have come up with to sort of conglomerate it into words that humans understand.
Well, thank you for building us up through all of that. We have talked on the podcast about how organizations and new fields of study in the 1800s use Shakespeare as a way to bring a sense of validity or legitimacy into their work. And to talk more about your book for a minute, your book specifically looks at the theater industry in New York City during this century, and there are 6 specific case studies that you examine. Can you tell us a little bit more about those case studies?
Yes. So they're laid out chronologically, which was in my brain just the best way to do it. And the case studies are selected first because of my personal interest in them, but then also as I tried to make sure that there was enough representation sort of across broad spectrums of representation that we could say we were looking at a phenomenon that was happening in many different spheres of economic life in New York City. So the first case study looks at the African Theater, which is the first theater made by Black artists for Black audience in the United States. It was founded by a man named William Brown in 1821. In 1821, slavery is still a legal practice in New York State. So this was a pretty gutsy move. And Brown, it turns out, is a pretty gutsy business person. Now, when I started researching William Brown, no one was talking about William Brown. That has delightfully changed in the last 10 years. But the thing I wanted to know was why he was performing Shakespeare. So William Brown, over the course of his business, they opened with a production of Richard III, and they performed Shakespeare at a couple different times. The pretty famous Black actor Ira Aldrich performed at the African Theater. And so my question became, what does Shakespeare mean to these actors and this audience, and what is it doing in William Brown's repertoire? So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2, I'm looking at P.T. Barnum. And P.T. Barnum, before he bought the circus that made him the household name we all know of, had a lot of other sort of a string of businesses. He would kind of make a lot of money and then do something else and then lose money and make money. And one of the businesses he had was what he called the American Museum and Lecture Hall in New York City. And it was this giant sort of multi-purpose museum. And I use museum loosely because in the 19th century, a museum was not quite what we think of as a museum today. For more on that, read my book. And one of the things that was in Brown's museum was what he called a lecture hall, but it was actually a theater. It was a well-appointed 19th century theater. And Barnum worked very hard to establish that this theater, unlike other theaters, was a completely moral and ethically sound place. And in doing so, used rhetoric that often leaned on Shakespeare. So my question then was, well, why? Like, what is Shakespeare providing in this quest for morality to P.T. Barnum? Chapter 3, I'm looking at an actress named Fanny Kemble. Fanny Kemble is an English actress who emigrates to the United States and marries a American business person named Pierce Butler. Pierce Butler is not a great guy, it turns out, and he owns plantations and he owns slaves, and Fanny Kemble does not like this very much and writes a whole lot about how terrible it is. And eventually the two wind up divorcing. And this is fairly radical in the mid-19th century for a woman to divorce her husband. And so over the course of the divorce, Fanny Kemble realizes that she needs to have a vocation. She was an actress in England and came from a very famous acting family. And when she got married, she says, I'm never going to act again. It's a terrible profession. But throughout the course of her divorce, she starts these Shakespeare readings, importantly readings. They're not actually fully produced productions. And so my question here is, what is Shakespeare doing for Kemble? And how is she using Shakespeare to sort of harness the publicity machine around this very sensational divorce and very public divorce? Chapter 4, I'm looking at the Booth family. So John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln, and he had two brothers who were all of them invested in the theater. Their father was a very famous English transplant actor. And I'm looking at how Edwin Booth, particularly, who is Wilkes' older brother, used Shakespeare to rehabilitate the Booth brand in the wake of the assassination, because he was successfully able to do that. How he did that is pretty interesting. So that's what we're doing here. Chapter 5, I am looking at the statue of Shakespeare in Central Park. It's located on the east side of the park at about like 69th Street-ish. And I'm a New Yorker my whole life. I walked by that statue going, what are you doing here? And so this chapter is, what are you doing here, Shakespeare? And why were you put here during the Civil War? Didn't they have other things to spend money on? Spoilers, they did. And so chapter 6, I'm looking at, so at the time it was a pretty famous benefit, but at this point it sort of faded into obscurity. There was a actor named Lester Wallack who was retiring from the acting profession. He was a very well-beloved celebrity of the 19th century. And when he retired, he was having some financial problems. And his friends, also very well-beloved celebrity actors, decided that they wanted to put on a benefit performance and give money to him and his wife to support him. So they pulled together like all of the famous star actors of the period to be in this production of like one night only Hamlet. And so this chapter is just an account of how that happened, and what had to come together to like make this crazy thing go. So that's what we're talking about through these 6 chapters.
Wow. All of that sounds so interesting and varied. And I'm really intrigued by how there are different representations of the like concepts of value that you explained earlier woven throughout those. Like obviously there's some people who are selling Shakespeare and some people who are using Shakespeare for non-monetary gain, which is super interesting.
I have a quick question. Elise and I think a lot about Shakespeare in his time and then Shakespeare beyond his time. And the opinion of Shakespeare, the value, I suppose, of Shakespeare ebbs and flows. In the time period that you're looking at, what is the general, like, I know that you've got 6 different case studies, but like, where does Shakespeare stand in terms of cultural capital generally amongst the century that you are investigating?
It's a really, really great question. Because if you think about the United States during this period, we go from sort of a loose collection of states to really strong nation building feelings towards the turn of the century. And over this time, our relationship with Shakespeare changes as well. At the beginning of the 19th century, I could find no evidence that Shakespeare was a lucrative product for theaters in the United States. But there still seemed to be a deified opinion of his cultural capital as a thing that like great actors would do, right? The United States did not yet have in 1800 its own native great actors. They hadn't been born yet, or they weren't working yet. Over the course of the 19th century, American actors start to adopt Shakespeare, start to adopt performance styles. And by the end of the century, Shakespeare is a lucrative product for theaters. I argue in the book's conclusion that this has a lot to do with Edwin Booth, that brother of John Wilkes Booth, lesser known now, but in his time, Edwin Booth was the most famous Booth brother. And Edwin Booth was particularly famous for his Hamlet, which he performed over the course of his career. So I make a sort of short argument that his Hamlet had a major impact on this cultural shift. The other thing that's happening in the 19th century, which I don't particularly talk about in this book, is great book collectors. So the time period in which wealthy Americans, like we think about J.J. Astor, all those Newport mansions, that's around this time period that starts to happen towards the end of the 19th century, obviously before the stock market crash. And right. And when rich people have more money than they know what to do with, they start to buy frivolous things. And one of the frivolous things in the United States that they're buying is really fancy books, antiquarian books, books with like beautiful ornate covers, original manuscripts, things like that. And because people are book collecting, Shakespeare becomes a viable product for book collectors because those folios, those first folios, second folios, third folios, fourth folios, become an object that people want as a status symbol. So that's also happening kind of simultaneous to this, but in a slightly different sphere.
Interesting. And I don't know the specifics of this, but I believe at the same time, like working class people were also reading Shakespeare during this time period to like educate themselves. So like amongst classes, it seems like Shakespeare was on the rise.
Yeah, this is also the time period where we get Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare and Charles Emery Bolder, so the Bolderizations, where there's this belief that reading Shakespeare is a moral and ethical education if you just redact the naughty bits. So, right, which, you know.
I think I've seen you react on Twitter to that.
Right. So it starts to become a hallmark of wealthy elite, of education, something that people aspire to. And there's all these tales about like 49ers reading Shakespeare and like cowboy Shakespeare's happening. And that's sort of like later in the time period. So yeah, it is all happening as the United States develops its own national identity, which I think is a really important part of this.
What is this identity that America settles on at this point?
Well, when the United States first starts thinking about national identity, the key factor is we're not England, right? Like that's the important part.
Hilarious choice.
Right.
This is also the time where like England's re-engaging with Shakespeare in new ways, and we're getting like the Stratford Festival for the first time and making him the poet laureate. So like everyone is reinvesting in Shakespeare all of a sudden.
Yes, and that's like one of the guiding questions of this book. Like if the most important part of our identity is we're not England, why did we pick Shakespeare? Like why is that the cultural capital that we Americanize out of anything we could have picked? It's Shakespeare. With the Civil War, we start to have this idea of like, are we like, what is a just nation, right? The North versus South. How do we envision ourselves? How do we envision human beings? And we all know how that ends. And then through westward expansion, it is definitely wrapped up in this working class versus elite culture. And at varying points in the century, one is generally deemed more American than the other, although we have edged towards working class for the majority of our birth as a nation. And somehow we brought Shakespeare along with that too. So it's all just so strange.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, Shakespeare is the only author that's compulsory in the public school curriculum. So what's he doing here?
Yes, and we even think about that now when we're seeing states like Florida with the Don't Say Gay laws try and re-Bolderize Shakespeare and remove Shakespeare from the course curriculum because it talks about gender and sexuality a little too much for conservative lawmakers. So we are coming back around in ways that are not necessarily good.
What is something in your research that surprised you?
So I'll start with the fact that the reason I chose the 19th century to work on, and this book came out of my dissertation, was because people in the 19th century were characters in ways that I have not encountered expressed in the other areas of history. And generally, when you're studying 19th century figures, you're looking at letters, you're looking at journals, you're looking at like very personal pieces of writing. So it's kind of like unfiltered thoughts of someone who is not afraid to tell you in writing what they think about something, but is doing so in prose that are, ye old timey. So it's really incredibly amusing. So that's sort of how I landed here. The thing that was the most surprising to me was how bad Edwin Booth's handwriting is. His handwriting is so bad that when you find letters written by Edwin Booth in an archive, it's not uncommon to find a transcribed copy typewritten by some angel of somebody who came before who like can read the handwriting better than you can. And then you can kind of like squint at the letter and like figure out what it says. I, for a very long time, sort of gnashed my teeth about how bad his handwriting was until one day I was at an archive and found a letter to Edwin Booth from his brother, Brutus Booth, who was also in that Julius Caesar show that I look at in chapter 4. And the letter is like, when you're writing letters, please write more carefully because neither myself nor mother nor our sister can make out your handwriting. So I felt validated and justified upon finding this letter.
It's probably more difficult than reading early modern, like words in terms of spelling.
Oh yeah, I mean, like spelling's out the window. I don't read secretary hand very well, which is the way early modern people formed letters. The thing about 19th century letters is particularly ladies would cross their letters to save
Mm-hmm.
paper. So you'll get, in theory, if you tilt it one direction, you get one part of the letter, and then if you tilt it the other direction, you get the other part of the letter, but it's just written over top. So like there's two full things happening on this one page. They're nearly impossible to read, and I hate them.
Yeah, I've seen some of those, and it is like just one piece of paper, and it's like backs, fronts, anything that I can use that I don't have to like fold in to make the envelope to send it is going to have writing smudge somewhere. I want to talk just a little bit more about the sort of sources that you used and encountered, because it sounds like you were able to access a lot of first-person documents during this research. Can you speak a little bit more about documents you were looking for when going through archives for this book?
Yeah, I mean, like one of the most thrilling things about being a historian is working at the archive because you don't know what you're going to find. I generally was looking for any piece of information that touched any of the characters. I think of them as movie characters, but any of the movie characters in my book or things that they touched, right? So like letters to them, letters from them, letters about them, journals that mention them, journals that they wrote, journals that people close to them wrote, right? Like one degree of separation here. I was very fortunate to be able to spend time at the Folger Shakespeare Library, where I found a whole lot of things that benefit. In the 6th chapter was produced by two men, Arnold Marshman Palmer and Augustine Daly. And I found, I can't remember if it was Palmer's letters to Daly or Daly's letters to Palmer, but you only get like one side of the conversation because it's like one person saved the letters. And it always amuses me that like when that happens, you are getting the side of the conversation saved by the more responsible party, but you're not getting the more responsible party's response to the letters. So that's fun. And then sometimes you'll find a letter that's like, I will meet you at this place at this time to talk about that thing. And you'll be like, I need a time machine right now. I need to go there because they didn't write it down. They talked about it and I know exactly where I need to go, but alas, I cannot get there. Should you have written an email or something summing up this meeting after the fact? Did you have to just write a letter saying, I will meet you at this time and place to talk about it?
Could we have had the meeting notes written down somewhere?
Right. For P.T. Barnum, I was looking at a lot of advertising ephemera. So P.T. Barnum created for the American Museum lots of like pamphlets that discussed what you would see when you were there. So it would like take you step by step through what he had at various times, almost like a museum guidebook. And then I looked at, they're called broadsides. So broadsides are basically 19th century theater posters, and they would list like everything happening in a theater. They're these big long pieces of paper. And the interesting thing about Barnum's broadsides from the American Museum, Barnum being Barnum, is on one side you would have a very traditional theatrical broadside, listing the plays, listing the musical acts, listing, 3 or 4 things that were happening. And then if you flip it over, you have like, come see the menagerie of animals and the missing link and other various colonial horrors. So it was almost like you could choose, if you received a Barnum broadside to put up in your establishment, if you wanted to show like the legitimate side with all the theatrical fare, or if you wanted to show the spectacle side with all of the animal acts and like human oddities. So that's pretty cool. I actually have a database where I logged all of my Barnum broadside work that's available on my website, daniellerosvally.com. So if you were interested in like digging through the data of what was being performed at P.T. Barnum's museum and lecture hall based on the broadsides I found, it was several hundred of them. I can't dig up the number for my brain how many I actually looked at. I think it was over 700. That is available on my website.
Very cool. We'll definitely link that in our episode description for anybody who wants to check that out. We've been talking about the archives, and the other day on TikTok, you posted through Yossified Shakespeare about how your work with the ossified Shakespeare sort of can intersect with this book and how TikTok specifically intersects with the work that you've done. Can you tell us a little bit more about how these three worlds all sort of intersect?
Yes, absolutely. So anyone who's engaged in TikTok right now is probably thinking about the various TikTok bans and legislation that it was pushed through in the spring. We certainly are at Ossified Shakespeare. And so like last April, I was at a conference and we were talking about history and archive, and the topic of theater fires came up. Now, if you're a 19th century historian, theater fires are the bane of your existence because you will be hot on a research trail thinking about something and be like, you know, it would be really useful if I could see this, right? If this item existed, and then realize it doesn't exist because it burned down when the theater burned down 100 years ago, right? And so I realized I had this little light bulb that was like, that's exactly what we're talking about when we talk about a TikTok ban. If you do any investigating in like the TikTok bans that have already been issued in India, overnight, basically, like creators could not access their own back videos, could not access anything via TikTok. And that kind of archival gap, it leaves a mark, it leaves a scar, it leaves something silenced. And so I started to think about what is being silenced in the event that a TikTok ban happens. Like, what are we actually losing here? And the answer really is because the so-called golden age of TikTok, when the app was on the rise, had the most downloads of any app ever over a certain quarter, was like 2019, 2020. So basically, the early days of the COVID pandemic were when people were really, really starting to engage with TikTok content. So that is what we would be losing, this massive, massive archive of pandemic era content that documented not just daily life and like how we were connecting as human beings when we had no other way to connect, but also just like, what did we find entertaining, right? The kinds of questions that I ask about history, I could easily see being asked by people in future generations about that time period. It was a historical time period. As theater and performance studies scholars, we think about how like online performance changed during the pandemic all the time. And to me, losing that repertoire would be a massive loss of information.
Yeah, it's almost like a metaphorical fire.
Right.
Thank you. I think it's such a insightful way to think about something that a lot of people find maybe frivolous. You know, it's social media, we don't need it. And think of it as a repertoire of people's lives and also performances. And yeah, I mean, early modern scholars too, because there's the big fire at the Globe Theater. We don't know what we don't have because the Globe Theater burned down, right? So as like Shakespeare scholars, if there weren't theater fires, we'd have so much more information and so many more answers to the questions that we ask.
Yeah, and we would certainly have different information, right?
Mm-hmm.
The sheer dearth of published early modern texts outside of Shakespeare's oeuvre is a big thing that I think we can partially attribute to these theater fires, right? You know, you lose paper.
Right.
And I chafe every time I hear somebody categorize social media as this like frivolous, terrible thing when it has become so ingrained in our lives, right? So I started to ask critical questions of myself about like, well, why is it so important to you that people not just treat TikTok as some like silly Gen Z phenomenon? And I was like, well, because it's not just some silly Gen Z phenomenon. There's a lot that's there. And if we want to talk about inclusion, equity, diversity, TikTok is really good at lending voices to people who don't have access in other ways. So we're just going to destroy that archive and say it was some silly thing that happened in the pandemic era? That doesn't seem right.
I do want to let people know if they have been intrigued by Theaters of Value and want to get a copy of this book, how can they?
So it is on Amazon, but you can also go straight through SUNY Press to get a copy. The book is pretty expensive, unfortunately, because it's an academic monograph, but I have two offerings. The first is that you can ask your library to buy books for you. It's pretty cool. Most libraries have a request form on their website, and you can just request that they purchase a copy, and that would be awesome. Or for the month of July, I'm having an online pizza party. So if you take a picture of yourself eating pizza, post it to Twitter, tag me, tag my press, hashtag Theaters of Value, I will DM you a 30% off discount code for the book.
That is a nice discount.
It's a pretty good discount, yeah. If you would like a Theaters of Value sticker, there are 2 exclusive Theaters of Value stickers that I will personally send to you if you request that your library purchase a copy of my book, and then on any social platform or via email, just notify me that you did so, and I will ask for your address, and you'll receive an envelope that I lovingly hand wrote with some stickers in it for you. They're cool. I'll include a picture to go with the episode.
Oh, love it. Request at your library. Post a picture of you with pizza. Join Danielle's pizza party.
Amazing.
Well, thank you so much, Danielle.
Thank you. This was fun.
Thank you for listening to this episode.
I'm Courtney Smith.
And I'm Elise Sharp.
This is Shakespeare, anyone?
Thank you so much for listening to Shakespeare, anyone. Works referenced in this episode are available in the episode description. Our theme music is Never Ending Minute by Sounds Like Sander. If you would like to support us, it would help us out if you would hit the subscribe button, like us, leave a comment, write a review, share us on social media, tell a friend about us, all the things. We'd appreciate it.
You can also support the podcast at patreon.com/ShakespeareAnyone.
Patreon patrons get access to exclusive bonus content throughout the year. The link is also in the episode description.
For more, you can visit our website, ShakespeareAnyone.com, follow us on Instagram at ShakespeareAnyonePod, or Twitter at ShakespeareAnyone. For Twitter, that's Shakespeare, Any, and the number 1. Every other platform is spelled out like the name of the podcast.
Now, because you listened all the way to the end of the credits, here's a completely random Shakespeare quote for you.
From Othello, Act 1, Scene 3, said by Iago. Put money in thy purse,